just overwhelming. But we've enjoyed it. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful country.
We need to find some means of exacting some more tax dollars out of these tourists.
I think there's a lot of traffic out on the Madison, but that's only kind of a selfish thing because I want to have it for my own.
I do feel that that development is a disease of our society.
Hello, I'm Terry Myers. We're on Amtrak's Empire Builder that runs from Seattle to Chicago. The train enters Montana near Libby and crosses the Continental Divide as it skirts the southern border of Glacier National Park. More than 122,000 people rode this train through Montana last year. They saw some of the most beautiful scenery on Earth, from the Rocky Mountains under the big sky through Montana's highline. The scenery of Montana can only be described as awesome. It's the state's #1 attraction. People come from all over the world. This group of Australians got off a train at Essex to visit Glacier National Park.
Wonderful, really wonderful, glorious scenery. We have nothing like it in Australia, unfortunately, and we're really enjoying ourselves.
Tourists bring and leave millions of dollars in Montana each year, but along with those dollars come problems. In this program, you'll see some of the more popular spots people visit in Montana and the effects of tourism beyond the beauty. For the small town of Ennis, it's the dilemma of needing the money but not the crowds. For outdoor recreation in western Montana, it's a matter of how much pressure the woods and streams can stand. And for whitefish, it's a question of how much development one small town can take. Tourists are brought here by the state's reputation as a major vacation destination. Through its Travel Montana office in Helena, Montana isn't shy about promoting itself. It ranks 24th among the states in tourism promotion spending. That's possible because in 1987, the legislature passed the so-called bed tax. Out-of-staters and Montanans alike began paying the 4% tax on hotel and motel rooms and any other lodging facility. That revenue allows the state to spend about $5.5 million to entice tourists to come here. Half that is spent on advertising, mostly television commercials like this one.
When Montana sings the sawgrass waves, the rivers roll, the mountains climb. When she sings the wild flowers, fill the fields of summertime. Like the sunset in the west, water flowing from a mountain spring. I feel the country in my heart when Montana sings.
All this advertising is worth it. Non-resident travelers to Montana spent more than $750 million here last year. That compounds into almost $1.7 billion when people are hired and new products and services are purchased to support tourist needs. The tourism industry creates nearly 27,000 jobs for Montanans. That adds up to $428 million earned by Montanans from tourism. The summer tourism season brings in the most money, $318 million last year. Spring, autumn, and winter are close behind. Travel Montana Director Sandra Gedges says her organization doesn't want huge numbers of people trampling through Montana and leaving very little money. She'd rather have smaller numbers leaving more.
The reason why we promote tourism is not to be nice to people from out of state. Definitely the reason why we promote tourism to Montana is to increase revenues for Montana. and to better our economy.
However, Gedges says Montana must have an eye on the quality it offers tourists.
We can't afford not to care about the type of experience that they have. I think we care very much.
One thing that attracts all this money to Montana is the state's incredibly rich history. This robotic dinosaur is only one of the mind-boggling exhibits visitors experience when they walk through the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman. Since the museum's new headquarters opened in 1989, more than 300,000 visitors have marveled at its collection of prehistoric recreations and artifacts from the region. Each spring, art lovers flock to Great Falls for the Charlie Russell auction, and year-round visitors to the CMR Museum stand in awe at the talent of Montana's legendary artists. The fate that befell General George Custer in 1876 attracts visitors to the national monument that bears his name. The site of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the most famous of all battles between whites and Native Americans, is on the Crow Reservation, one of 7 in Montana set aside for the many Indian tribes that make up part of the state's heritage. Attractions like the annual Crow Fair bring tourists and their much-needed dollars to these reservations. Many visitors don't hang around very long, however, because they have an antiquated view of Indians. In Browning, Blackfeet tribal spokesman Curly Bear Wagner.
They go right through to Glacier National Park. The reason they don't stop, they still think we're savages, and that just by reading it's a myth. You know, it's a stereotype.
Some tourists simply stare at Native Americans, then go on their way. Others learn about tribal cultures in places like Browning's Museum of the Plains Indians. The adventures and exploits of Montana's notorious copper barons draw thousands to Butte each year. The Berkeley Pit was the nation's largest truck-operated open-pit mine. It was carved out of a mountain that was dubbed the richest hill on earth. Marcus Daly's mansion in Hamilton, emblematic of the Copper King's wealth and lifestyle, attracts thousands of the curious each year. But Copper Kings and Custer and all the rest pale in comparison when a tourist comes to Glacier National Park and gazes at this. There aren't many places in the world like Lake McDonald. Its beauty and serenity put it in a class all its own. Tourists who want to share their lunch with wild animals create a major worry for park officials. Mountain goats are more tolerant of humans and so are fed more by tourists. Bears are less tolerant. The last fatal mauling of a human by a bear occurred in 1987. It's the combination of wildlife and scenery that fill the park's lodges and campgrounds each summer. Capacity crowds bring typical overload problems here and elsewhere in the state. If you travel to southern Montana, you'll be in Yellowstone country, the gateway to Montana's other national park, Yellowstone. Here's reporter Rebecca Lewis.
It happens about every 80 minutes. One of nature's wonders. Tourists come from all over the world to see Old Faithful. The lower falls of the Yellowstone River, another breathtaking scene in the nation's oldest national park. Most of Yellowstone National Park's 2.2 million acres are in Wyoming, but the park and the attractions around it bring more than $150 million into Montana each year. In 1988, one of the most monumental events in Yellowstone's 119-year history threatened to destroy much of this beauty. A drought and summer lightning touched off the biggest fire season the park has ever known. The fires burned over 900,000 acres of Yellowstone's landscape. Nearly 3 years have passed since then, and the land still bears the scars. But the charred landscape isn't keeping Yellowstone's tourists away. They came in record numbers the year after the fires. 2.7 million visitors came in 1989 and almost 3 million in 1990. Before the 1991 summer season even started, park visits were ahead of schedule. But as the number of tourists keeps increasing, so do the problems. Dennis Glick represents an environmental watchdog organization called the Greater Yellowstone Coalition.
We're sort of nickel and diming Greater Yellowstone to death. We're slowly but surely losing that ecological integrity losing the special wildland character that makes this place so special.
The coalition wants to make sure lodges, campgrounds, and other tourist facilities aren't built around prime grazing, breeding, or nesting grounds. Wild animals are a major attraction to tourists who sometimes get too close. Last year, 4 tourists were injured by animals in the park. Yellowstone's Morning Glory Pool and other geothermic features are also feeling the heat of increased tourism. Park workers recently pumped the water out of Morning Glory. They scooped out several buckets full of coins, keys, and other debris that visitors had tossed into it over the years. As park officials struggle to cope with the millions who visit each year, they also face another serious problem: decaying roads, bridges, and buildings. The park's roads are badly in need of repair. Because of heavy traffic and a short construction season, it may take 20 years to fix them.
It was pretty pothole city in certain areas.
3 of the 5 park entrances are in Montana: West Yellowstone, Cook City, and Gardner. West Yellowstone is a flourishing tourist town with all the trappings. While a summertime boom often means a wintertime depression, West Yellowstone doesn't have that problem because in winter, the only way to get into the park is on a snowmobile, a snowcat, or on cross-country skis. Last winter, about 75,000 people toured the area on snowmobiles and spent their money in West Yellowstone. 70 miles up the Madison Valley, the economic situation is far different. The town of Ennis is striving to bridge the gap between the boom of the summer tourist season and the stagnant winter months. Ennis boasts some of the nation's best trout fishing in the nearby Madison River. It also offers many camping, hiking, and backpacking opportunities during the summer. But in the winter, the town nearly dries up.
It looks like a one-horse town, is what it looks like. It's pretty empty, pretty barren.
Lee Poole and his wife Lathy own Western Art Galleries in Ennis, West Yellowstone, and Big Sky. Lee says almost 100% of their business comes from tourists. Poole says he'd like to see the state do more to promote winter tourism so towns like Ennis don't have to go through such feast and famine cycles. Step 1 would be the controversial Jack Creek Road. If the Ennis Chamber of Commerce, the Alliance for Madison County, and others have their way, this road would be turned into a scenic highway that connects Ennis and Big Sky. The town hopes the road would funnel Big Sky's winter tourists across the Madison Range and into Ennis. An 11-mile link would make the drive between Big Sky and Ennis 20 miles instead of the present 80-mile route. The 30-minute drive would make it possible for people from Ennis to commute to Big Sky for work during the winter season. A local task force is pushing for federal funding to build and maintain the road through Jack Creek. Task force member Nancy Griffin.
We have 3 to 4 months out of the year to make a living in this valley. Access to Big Sky ski area and their convention area and a lot of the winter-type recreation that goes on in that community would allow this community to diversify its economy into a year-round economy rather than a seasonal economy.
Jack Creek Guest Ranch owner Pete Combs says he would make more money if the road went through, but Combs says the traffic created by the road would harm the area.
Ecologically, it is a disaster. My bank account's going to look really great, but the offsetting thing of it is what it's going to do to the animals and such that are here.
Montana State University studies say a highway through Jack Creek may force wildlife to find other habitat and could damage the cutthroat trout in Jack Creek. Wilderness Society economist Ray Rasker says the road doesn't make sense for Ennis.
If we build little roads all over the place, little by little starts to make the place look a little bit frayed around the edges. And I think the Madison Valley is still one of those fairly pristine agricultural valleys. And the Jack Creek Road could very well start whittling away at that.
River guide Bob Cleverly says he's introduced many clients to the Madison, but sometimes he wishes his favorite fishing holes weren't so popular.
I think I get frustrated a little bit sometimes on the river. I think there's a lot of traffic out on the Madison. But that's only kind of a selfish thing because I want to have it for my own.
So the debate will continue in towns like Ennis. As Montanans seek to protect the beautiful, isolated areas they live in, they also struggle to find ways to make a living. Encouraging a growing tourist trade is one way, But here, a number of people are also concerned about the price tag. In Ennis, I'm Rebecca Lewis.
This is the Beartooth Highway in south-central Montana. Some call it the most beautiful road in the world. In the early 1900s, visionaries from the Bear Creek and Red Lodge communities thought there needed to be a scenic route over the Beartooth Mountains into Yellowstone Park. About 36 years later, this road was finished. And now, some 90 years later, tourists use it as the northeast entrance into Yellowstone Park, but more so to capture its spectacular view of mountains and wilderness. Visitors flock to areas like these because to them, this is wilderness. Whether an area is an officially designated wilderness is not important. These Forest Service campgrounds just off the Beartooth Highway are popular sites for tourists who crowd into them not only because of the scenic view, but because of easy access from the highway. This past Memorial Day's gloomy weather didn't stop people from setting up camp. However, as more and more visitors fill up campsites in the summer months, finding a spot isn't always easy. Here's a look at how the state is handling increased pressure on the wilderness and on the state's world-class fishing streams. Reporter Amy Taylor begins with an outfitter whose job is to take people to the backcountry.
Well, I'm an outlaw because I go into the backcountry, I go into the wilderness area, and I steal the wilderness from the wilderness itself. And I do that because I can put it into the minds of my guests. And I can do that and continue to do that as long as I don't leave any trace that I've ever been there.
The lure of outfitter Smoke Elser's offer to steal a bit of the Bob Marshall Wilderness area for his guests draws people from all over the world and from all walks of life. Outfitters like Elser are licensed by an outfitter board under the guidance of the State Department of Commerce. The Montana Outfitters and Guides Association makes recommendations for regulations to that board. Each outfitter is allotted so many days in the backcountry by the U.S. Forest Service. Although they dislike some of these rules, outfitters realize they are necessary to protect the resource that gives them a living. Smoke supports these regulations because he fears that society's endless hunger for expansion and development will infringe upon and eventually destroy the wilderness.
Development is a disease of our society. And with the development coming on, we need to be very cognizant of what it does to the total resource.
Overuse of their business-supporting resource, the state's waterways, also threatens fly fishing guides in Montana. Blue Ribbon rivers and streams like this stretch of Rock Creek near Clinton draw sportsmen who crowd the shores and waterways throughout the state. Fly fishing guides like Jim Toth recognize that regulations are necessary to protect Montana's streams and rivers, but he doesn't want to push the tourists away.
By owning a fly shop and being a guide, it's obviously, it's to my livelihood that I'd like to see it. But on the same hand, you don't want to kill the goose that's laying the golden egg either. You know, you don't want to trash the rivers. You don't want to make the fishing so bad that people stop coming.
Because they feel the need to protect their business, guides are willing to support some regulations. But Bitterroot River guide Randy Scott worries that it may hurt the industry if regulation is taken too far.
You know, the state's promoting tourism. They want people to come here and fish. So it's right there in itself is a catch-22. You want people to come and fish. You want people to come pay money. But then if you don't let them fish, then they're not going to come back here to fish.
Use limitations are not a reality yet on most rivers. However, there are limitations on an angler's catch. Tourists hire guides to worry about restrictions like these posted near the Bitterroot River. But how do Montanans feel about the complexity of these regulations and the overcrowding? Rock Creek angler Carl Fiedler expresses his feelings.
Too restrictive of fishing, I don't think, is consistent with the Montana lifestyle. On the other hand, totally unrestricted fishing, if we're looking at keeping the reasonable quality we have, it'll be hard to have both.
Courtney Taylor, a retired game warden, worries about the survival of the resource itself, more than the ability of fishermen to exhaust the supply of fish available.
Probably the worst thing that can happen to us is destroy the habitat. This is probably more costly than fishermen ever were, is destroying the habitat as far as the fish are concerned. Big game or birds, whatever you're dealing with.
Although some conservationists believe that Montana's waterways are running out of fish, you don't hear that from the guides. They say that because most anglers use the catch and release practice, and because fishing is not an easy sport, they're not worried about fish depletion. Overcrowding affects the sport in the form of a conflict between bank fishermen and raft fishermen. Even though guides claim to steer clear of them, the bank anglers complain that the rafts disrupt their fishing.
I think the conflict may actually be more almost in terms of physical conflict, where one person's line is in the water or fly is on the surface and a boat goes right by and disrupts the fishing in that manner.
Tourists and Montanans alike often make use of the fishing access points and campgrounds run by the State Parks Department. The department manages more than 400 such sites, like this one at Placid Lake. State dollars are lean for these areas. Montana spends only 49 cents on each state park visitor. That ranks 48th among the states. With a long history of poor support from the legislature, the park system has been forced to close recreation areas, or to put them into a trust to be run by private interests. Take the case of Montana's oldest standing building, St. Mary's Mission in Stevensville. Because the state could not afford to protect this historic site, 3 local women have dedicated the last 10 years to restoring this popular tourist attraction. The State Parks Department collects fees for most of its services, but they are by no means enough to make much-needed improvements to the recreation areas.
The private sector of the tourist industry has already recognized the need to preserve the resources which keep tourist dollars flowing into Montana, and the state government is slowly following that lead. Although the legislature did allot almost $500,000 in general funding, as well as another $500,000 in special tax revenues to the State Parks Department this year, this falls short of the recommended $6 million a year for operations and capital improvements. This recommendation comes from this report, prepared by the State Parks Futures Committee. The committee was appointed by Governor Stevens to assess the state park situation. This report also points out that the state government must work to preserve the Wild West mystique that continues to attract visitors. Smoke Elser worries that the whole outdoor recreation industry will not survive without proper regulation and funding.
And as long as politics is a roadblock, and the average citizen probably doesn't take enough, put enough interest into politics, we may never get it done.
On Placid Lake, I'm Amie Taylor.
To accommodate the increasing number of tourists, the state must provide additional facilities. Many tourist areas, like here at Big Sky Resort, are building new lodging facilities, shops, and restaurants to keep up with the needs of the tourists. Big Sky is experiencing an increase in skiers, so it had to build this 94-unit condominium to house its visitors. This is part of a statewide problem. Tourists like our state so much, they're buying up properties and building second homes. But since they're not becoming permanent residents, they're using our state and not getting much in return. Here's reporter Teresa Bell in Whitefish, a town dramatically affected by tourism.
Whitefish was a sleepy lumber town until 1903, when the Great Northern Railroad moved in. The railroad brought the first tourists into the area to fish and hunt. As the town grew, it left behind a sea of stumps and mud, which earned the nickname Stumptown. In 1947, Great Falls businessman George Prentice and his partner Ed Schenck bet everything they had that the mountain above Whitefish would be a great place for a ski resort.
It was one of the better areas that we'd even looked at, and so we felt that there was a lot of potential here. I'm sure that there were people downtown that would bet anything we were never going to open up, but we did.
The gamble proved luckier than either of the founders could have imagined. 44 years later, this resort has become one of the top ski areas in the Northwest. Although the ski industry is on the decline nationally, numbers of skiers coming to Big Mountain are on the rise. Over 280,000 skiers visited Big Mountain last winter. That's more than visited Wyoming's famous Jackson Hole. But money isn't the only thing tourists bring with them on vacation. They also bring problems. Locals, therefore, have mixed opinions on tourists.
Well, they bring money in, but they're kind of obnoxious. They're the ones that help bring in the party atmosphere. They get to be a burden, too much traffic in the summer.
Well, I'm a downtown businessman, so I enjoy the tourists in town.
During the last decade, Whitefish grew by more than 13%, while the state's population declined. Whitefish is now home to 4,200 permanent residents. Carol and Bart Erickson have lived here for over 15 years. They've seen many effects of tourism on their community and want more laws to protect the environment and preserve the character of Whitefish.
I think we have to be really careful not to let this area become, say, another Aspen or Vail. If we start filling up the whole valley with buildings, and if we have unplanned growth and that sort of thing, then I think we lose the very thing that makes most of us like living here.
Big Mountain marketing manager Steve Rohde doesn't want that to happen either.
Is your goal to make another Aspen or Vail?
Absolutely not.
We get asked that a lot. So no, we have no desire to become another Aspen or Vail. It's not part of our planning process. But there is room for more skier visits here.
Rody says skier visits could safely get up to 500,000 without drastically changing the character of Whitefish. But he says some changes are inevitable.
Montana's going to grow. Now, we have a choice. It can grow in spite of us, and we can just sit around and panic about it, and it'll get out of hand, and we won't have the proper zoning and things that are necessary. Or we can take an active role in it, and we can say, we know it's going to happen. We will take a positive approach to it and say it's good for us for this to happen. And we want to have some influence on it. We want to control it.
Big Mountain plans on staying in stride with tourism by building more runs and lifts, as well as more lodges and hotels. Construction could begin this summer, but the mountain isn't the only area with new developments popping up. Others include Whitefish Lake Lodge Complex, which will consist of 51 condos and a 100-room hotel on the east shore of Whitefish Lake, additions to Mountain Harbor Complex on the road up to Big Mountain, and a 275-room hotel plus condos on this site near the Whitefish Lake Golf Course. Although more accommodations will bring in more money, they also bring more problems. The Ericksons say increased visitors have put greater burdens on local taxpayers.
I thought I'd never say this, but I think we need to find some means of exacting some more tax dollars out of these tourists, because although they do bring money in and spend it, there's no question that they use the roads, the streets, the facilities, and we need to find some way of tapping into them a little bit to help pay for the cost of keeping up those facilities. The whole infrastructure needs help in the Flathead.
And have that money be able to stay in the local area where the impact is.
Yeah.
One big attraction in Flathead Valley that doesn't involve a pair of skis and a lift ticket is golf. The Whitefish Lake Golf Course was established in 1936 and is one of the most popular in the area. Tourists play 40% of the rounds here, and locals say that it's tough getting on during peak tourist season.
We're up here sometimes at 4:30 in the morning to get tee times.
Golf course officials try to reserve tee times in a way that's fair. Construction is also about to begin on 9 more holes. Golf pro Mike DeWallaby says local golfers support the addition.
The locals are really delighted because they think that maybe that'll help. If there is any negatives on not being able to get on the golf course, this might help the situation immensely.
Buffalo Hill Golf Course in Kalispell is slightly less dependent on tourists than Whitefish. Only 35% of its golfers are tourists. But at Eagle Bend in Big Fork, 60% of the golfers last year were tourists. The stability of golf courses isn't the only thing dangerously dependent on tourism money. Mayor Marjorie Fisher says she's worried about the entire whitefish economy.
I feel that we have an overemphasis on tourism simply because if the economy in Canada drops or some other things happen, like a war with gasoline prices going sky high, it would hurt the tourism. So it puts us in sort of a situation with a boom-bust cycle, and I would like to see us have a more diversified economy.
The Buffalo Cafe is a popular restaurant in Whitefish. Owner Charlie Metzold says he depends on tourists for about 50% of his sales, but sometimes he'd rather be without them.
Well, personally, I guess I just deal with the locals. It gets real crowded. Their money is marvelous. But it gets so busy in here in the summertime that the pace is hard to work, you know. The pros of it, of course, is the cash that it generates. So we get really busy, and it shows up in the checkbook.
Back in the mid-1940s, when Whitefish residents started enticing more tourists into their area, they didn't realize what they were getting themselves into. They had no other nearby tourist towns to study, nor did they have any set of guidelines to follow.
It was as if the tourism industry were a tornado, which swept into town and changed everything. Except this tornado never left. Instead, residents had to learn how to control it and tap into its resources. Zoning laws and community involvement have given residents more control, but they're not totally in charge yet, and they may never be. In Whitefish, I'm Teresa Bell.
It's no wonder tourists pack Montana every year. The beauty of this state is incredibly alluring. But as we have documented in this program, there's another side to all these visitors. Lots of crowds, especially during the summer, a surge of development, and new pressure on the environment. The debate over tourism is a tug of war. One side, the state and much of the business community, is pulling for the money tourists bring with them. Tugging on the other side are many Montanans who don't want too many people on their streams, in their woods, and in their small towns. A question that will cause much debate in the future is economically, shouldn't Montana attract all the tourists it can? On the other hand, how much additional strain are Montanans willing to place on their environment and their way of life? For the Student Documentary Unit of the University of Montana School of Journalism, I'm Terry Myers.
And they'll be satisfied to keep it on the ground with Dixon. You felt like before this contest, Clay, that we might see something out of the ordinary from Jackson State. Maybe a reverse, maybe a fleet, some type of something that you normally don't see in a football game except for on a surprise occasion.
They mentioned a couple gadgets. And yet again, the Tigers are forced to turn it over. 4th and 21. On comes McCray.
48-7. We'll be back after this.
But it's far too little and way too late.
I would think it'd be a pleasure working with that man there. We had a chance to chat for about an hour yesterday, and sounds like a great guy.
Absolutely. One of the best in the business. He'll do anything he can to help you.